Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm a huge fan and have been for years of ICFJ and of the work you do. It's so important. And I'm truly honored to be in the company of some terrific journalists whom I hugely admire. You know, as journalists, sometimes you're traveling and you turn on the TV and you see some, three-part series about a runaway bride or something, and you flinch. And then you see people like those being honored today, and I'm just full of admiration. I last ran into Richard Engel in Bahrain in a hospital as it was treating people who'd just been shot in a protest there. Umar I've known and admired for years for his extraordinary courage in empowering civil society and providing accountability in Pakistan. And Roman, boy, your work is just extraordinary. And, what we need to do is figure out a foreign aid package for Russia and Pakistan to provide assistance so that they can come to the U.S. and we can loose them here on the U.S. Boy, think of the reporting they do here. I want to, we have such an incredibly talented group here. I want to tell you about something that happened to me when my wife and I first moved to China as reporters, and I want to get your sense of how we should have handled it. Now, this was 1988, and we had to live in the official New York Times bureau chief apartment in Beijing, and we knew it was bugged, partly because one of our Chinese friends who spoke English worked part-time translating the comments that were taped in our apartment. It's not only the NSA that sometimes has security flaws, and so we knew the apartment was bugged, and then somebody pointed out to us a little grill that was just inside our apartment and said that's where the bugs were. And so I got a stepladder, and this was this metal grill against the wall, and I peered through with a flashlight, and there was a little cubbyhole back there with some electronic gadgetry. I got a claw hammer and pulled off the grill and peered in, and I was so impressed with myself that, I'd been studying Chinese, and here I could recognize those Chinese characters. And they were the characters for electronic sound carrying device. We had found the bug. So Cheryl and I, my wife and I, we were well prepared for this, having read Robert Ludlum novels. So we went to the bathroom and turned the shower on and whispered into each other's ears about how to handle this. And one option, as we saw it, was just to leave them in place, the well-behaved option. The second option was to destroy them. And the third option was to leave them in place and use them as our own private disinformation channel to the Chinese government. So I want to get your opinion on that. Do you leave them in place? Do you destroy them? Or do you use them as a disinformation channel? How many of you would have been well-behaved and just left them in place? Not a particularly well-behaved crowd, I must say, boy. How many of you would have destroyed the bugs? I'm just going to take a few names down for the Chinese government. They'll pay me. And how many of you would have used them as a disinformation channel? Yeah. Great minds think alike. That's exactly what Cheryl and I were agreeing to do. And just at that moment, a friend arrived at the front door, and we found out what an electronic sound-carrying device is in Chinese. It's a doorbell buzzer. Well, we were utterly deflated, but it was a useful way to learn a certain amount of humility, which is one of the most important things one gains by being abroad, by traveling, and one of the most important things one can bring to journalism. And these days, as we look around, there are tough times in journalism, and maybe it is a time for some humility. Our business model is eroding. We have moved toward what Nicholas Negroponte called the daily me, where because of the political polarization of news sources, if you're liberal, you can find your liberal news sources. If you're conservative, your conservative ones. You can find sources to not question your ideas and your prejudices, but confirm them. And I think that's probably unhealthy for the media and for democracy as a whole. And indeed, I'm kind of saddened when I see some of the polling about the media. 42% of Americans think that the news media are immoral. As many Americans think that the media hurt democracy as think they're essential for it. And given the constraints on budgets, we're also seeing, to some degree, a retreat from covering some really important international stories. One of the things that really shook me came after the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation provided a $1.5 million grant to one of the networks, one of the broadcast networks, to cover global health and nutrition stories. Essentially, it was a $1.5 million bribe to cover the kind of stories we should be doing. And that network did great stories with that money. They won prizes. Everybody thought that it was a success. But after a year, then the Gates Foundation was ready to renew it. And the network decided, no, they didn't want to renew it, that even though these were important stories and even though they were being paid to cover them, that was the time when viewers were going to the bathroom or going to the kitchen. And at the end of the day, it's hard to argue with that. I mean, the problem is that if you're an executive producer of a TV show, then you can send some reporters to cover a story like Congo, the most lethal conflict since World War II. And it's dangerous, and it's incredibly expensive, and your viewership will be less than if you put Democrats and Republicans in a room together and have them yell at each other. And that's one of the fundamental constraints we have. And in that context, I think it becomes so important to empower some overseas journalists and get their voices. I must say that my thinking on this has evolved. That there was a time early in my career when I thought that the focus on international journalism was a little bit self-indulgent on the part of the press. That there's so many causes, so many issues. Why should we really be focusing so much on the trials and tribulations of fellow reporters? And my thinking changed, and let me tell you why it changed. In covering global poverty and global conflict, then it seems to me that the single best predictor of a country kind of getting its act together is whether it has good governance. There are other factors, including how much education that society has, but the single most important factor is good governance. And indeed, to try to achieve good governance, the United States, the UN, other countries, we invest enormous sums in trying to support the political process and civil society and elections, for example. And it's kind of intuitive because we live in a society of laws that elections may be a way to achieve it. But one of the things that I've sometimes seen is that the election toolbox isn't as reliable as we might hope. In Congo, the international community in 2005 spent $1 billion on elections there. Didn't obviously improve governance, and you couldn't help thinking what that money might have achieved in building schools, for example. Or you're looking at Burma right now, where somebody I have hugely admired, Aung San Suu Kyi, a heroic woman, now, because she wants to be president, is becoming, shall we say, much less heroic in her comments about the minority Muslim population in Burma. You look at what elections have sometimes done in Sri Lanka, and it seems to me that elections are part of the answer, but that they're maybe not as reliable a toolbox as we would like. So what can work? Well, it seems to me that the toolbox that we haven't relied enough on is the role of journalists in civil society. And that the reason that ICFJ and local news organizations are so important isn't just because of solidarity with fellow journalists, but it's because that is maybe the most cost-effective and most reliable way to bring a measure of civil society and accountability to countries that desperately need it. If you fund a website or a small radio program, or in Liberia, one news organization is a chalkboard in the capital in Monrovia, and there's a journalist who goes out and gets news, and he writes news on that chalkboard, and people come by and read it. It doesn't have to cost a lot, but in the absence of other sources, that does begin to provide some accountability. Every $1,000 invested in journalism in some of these countries can reduce the corruption in those countries by, who knows, $1 million, maybe more. I think it's a powerful leverage that we have to support transformation. It's also dangerous. And in this country, people often focus on the dangers that American journalists take, and those are real. I must say a special shout out to photographers and cameramen. My basic rule of covering conflicts is you never accept a ride from a photographer or a cameraman. They hear gunfire and they rush to it. And so it's fine to give them a ride in your car, but never hitchhike with a cameraman. But at the end of the day, we have a certain amount of protection because of who we are. I remember in Darfur once, in a village, with my interpreter, a local journalist, and the Janjaweed militia was approaching. I was frantically trying to interview everybody I could before they arrived, and he said, look, if we miscalculate and they arrive, then they will hold you for ransom because you're valuable, you're worth something. Me, they're just going to shoot me right away. And he was right. And I left. A Chinese journalist once told me that he noted that there are two main kinds of bicycles at that time in China: the flying pigeon, the feige, and the eternal one, Yongjiu, forever, I think was the English name. And he said, "You foreign correspondents, you're the flying pigeons. We're forever, and we take the risks." And that's absolutely true. And I think one of the most important things we can do, and that ICFJ does, is support some of these extraordinary journalists around the world who are in the lighting business, not the heating business, but who are in that spotlight business, having a huge impact on providing accountability, on informing people about things like polio campaigns. If you want to have a polio campaign to eradicate polio, you need field workers to provide the polio vaccine, but you need to have journalists who are writing about public health issues. So they're indispensable. And at the end of the day, we have journalists, extraordinary people like Umar, like Roman, who are here in this very glamorous setting, being feted and being honored. But when the lights go down, they're going to go back to their countries and continue this incredibly brave reporting. There are others. There are 17 journalists who are now being held in Syria, we believe. At least 70 journalists were killed last year around the world because they were journalists. There are other journalists who were killed. We're not sure the reasons. Perhaps that was also because of what they wrote or covered. But I hope that that a support for that kind of extraordinary and courageous journalism won't be a one-day event for all of us, but will be something that we carry through day by day to show solidarity and support for that kind of extraordinarily important work. And I salute the ICFJ for doing that. Thank you very much.